I spent the past week in Washington, D.C., and part of it in Williamsburg as well. So it was a very historical week. We did the time-honored tradition of dragging your kids from boring monument to boring monument to other boring monument, seeing all the historical stuff. And some of it was interesting, and a lot of it was enjoyable and fun. And so we walked all around Williamsburg and D.C. and all of these things, and we saw all the famous monuments, and I hadn't been there in something like 14 or 15 years. And so there were new monuments. There was the Roosevelt Memorial, and there was the World War II Memorial that I had never seen, and Martin Luther King, which isn't even done yet. And so it was really a different trip. And I think when you go to Washington at different phases of your life, as I have, there's been about, I think, maybe 10 or 15 years between each time that I've gotten to go. And you see it differently every time you go. And this time, it was really a wonderful gift because we got to actually go sit in Congress. I don't know if y'all have gotten to do that, but we went to, all you have to do is go to your representative's office. So we went to Tom Price's office. He's our representative, and he, not him, but his aides, of course, gave us some Georgia peanuts. They have them available in their office for Georgia people who come to visit, and passes to go sit in the gallery. And so we went and sat in the Senate. And right as we sat down, John McCain started to give a speech. How cool is that? And he talked all about this shipbuilding thing that he's really concerned about, and we Googled the heck out of it and tried to figure out what he was talking about, and we didn't quite get there, but he was very passionate. And he gave this speech, and we thought, John McCain, there he is. You know, this is actual government. And then we got to go to the House of Representatives, and when we sat down, someone was holding forth on HB 2711, which I can't tell you what it is, but I remember the number. HB 2711, and someone was speaking, and then we actually got to see a vote. We got to see him press the little green and red buttons, and we got to see the Democrats pressed yes, the Republicans pressed no. So we got to see, just like you hear about, divided down the sides of the aisle, and somebody stalled and somebody delayed, and I thought, government. But it was really cool to see it in action. Even though, seeing actual Congress and all those things happen, I thought, it was cool that week, but there really was a lot of hot air. You hear that, but hot air is something that I was thinking about, and when they were giving the speeches, and it seems like nothing's happening, and I was thinking about Ecclesiastes and this word that we get, and I know Pastor Grunke talked about it last week. This cool word, when he got to show off his Hebrew, now I get to show mine off, it's the same word. When he talked about it, I think it was meaninglessness, that everything is meaningless, that everything is vanity. It's the same word, but another translation for that word could be hot air. And so, of course, that's what I was thinking about. Vanity, meaningless, hot air, just breath. Something that isn't going to last very long. Something that we think about when we think about how our government operates sometimes. It's just a lot of hot air. It's meaningless. It's vanity. It's just dust in the wind. And that's what they were talking about in Ecclesiastes. And I think sometimes when we think about this, this whole hot air Washington phenomenon, we're tempted to say, and I've heard it, that this is the worst time that we've ever had, that things are terrible, that the moral decay of America is happening, that things have never been worse than they are right now. Well, if you think that, I would invite you to go to Williamsburg. Because I promise you, in the 1760s, things were worse than they are right now. People were traitors. People were spies. Your neighbor might have been a loyalist for the British. You might have been a loyalist for the British because, they're taking care of us, right? People weren't sure which side anyone was on, and they weren't sure which was the right way to go in the 1760s. And so there was a Lutheran pastor who gave a sermon in the 1760s. And he used this text of Ecclesiastes, and he talked about how there is a time to preach, there's a time to use words, but there's also a time for war. he used this Ecclesiastes text, this Bible verse, to call his congregation to fight against the British. And I thought, talk about politics from the pulpit. I bet he got angry letters. But he used that text to say, now is a time that we resist and that we stand up. And he used Ecclesiastes to say to his congregation, now is the time that we're all going to fight and support the war effort. When I was in D.C., it seemed like every 100 years, there was a big conflict or upheaval in our country. The 1760s was the first one, and then, of course, the 1860s. We went to the Lincoln Memorial, and it's got to be one of my favorites. And we went at night, and so Lincoln is all lit up, and he's got quotes and the Gettysburg Address and all of those things around him. And in that time, wouldn't you know, Lincoln was giving a speech, and he used these words from Ecclesiastes to talk about how there is a time for war, and then there is a time for healing, for the country to come back together. He gave what was almost a sermon from this president, talking about how there was a time when we needed to fight, and it was terrible. But we felt like the evil of slavery, which was something that they were divided down the aisles. Can y'all imagine? Some yea and some nay. They felt so strongly about it that they needed to fight, but then Abraham Lincoln said, now is the time, just like it says in those ancient verses, for us to come back together and be a country, and they were. And then in the 1960s, of course, with all of the upheaval of that time, which I know some of you lived through, these verses came up again. Now, I love Pete Seeger. He is a folk singer from the 1960s, and I know if you're under maybe 30, you don't know who he is, probably. But the way you can know one of his most famous songs is in the movie Forrest Gump, which most of us, I took a poll, have seen. And on the scene when Jenny comes crashing through the mall, and she finds Forrest Gump, and they're leaving, and he's on the bus in Washington, D.C., and he says to her, which my husband and I kept quoting, I had a wonderful time with you in our nation's capital. She says to him, when she leaves, she gives him the peace sign, and the famous song starts playing, which is, of course, turn, 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 to everything there is a season. You can sing it later on your own time. You're welcome. They start playing this famous song at this famous moment, to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. Pete Seeger wrote some amazing songs, and I know he was controversial back then. I know he was a radical. I know that he even joined the Communist Party. He was a crazy kind of guy. But he sang some wonderful songs. And this song he took almost directly from the Bible. He said he felt guilty about the copyright because he only really wrote 6 words that weren't in the Bible, which is a time for peace. I swear it's not too late. And then, of course, turn, turn, turn. He wrote this song in the 1960s, which if you see every 100 years, our country struggles with something, with a big issue that people don't feel like they can compromise on, and people spout a lot of hot air here and there, and it seems all meaningless, like it's never going to get anywhere. But when you go back to the 1700s, which is kind of what you do when you go to Williamsburg or go to Washington, D.C., you can see that in all of these times of war and times of peace and times of love and times of hate and all of these things, you can see that we have gotten somewhere as a country. We have. We've made some progress in all of these things. In the 1960s, when Pete Seeger wrote this song, he was thinking about all of this history and that there is a time and that it was comforting for him. Now he's like everybody's grandpa when he's interviewed, and he was talking about this song, and he said that it was so comforting to him, even in that time, to know that there was a season, that we don't know what's going to happen next. But Pete Seeger said, only God knows. God knows what's going to happen next. So I wonder what's going to happen in the 2060s. That's not that far off. Maybe 40 or 50 years from now, some of us might be there then. And I'm sure in our country, someone will say, it's worse than it's ever been before. The country is in moral decay. It's terrible. And someone will probably bring up Ecclesiastes and say, there's a time for everything, and there's a season, and there's a time for every purpose under heaven. And God will be there through all of those seasons, through all of those cycles of life. When you see people pray, you usually see them look a certain direction, like in a cartoon or in a movie or something. Which direction do they usually look when they're praying? They usually look straight up. When they're, I promise, sometimes they look down. Usually I've seen them looking up, like God is in the clouds somewhere. But I was thinking about the exact opposite of hot air, the exact opposite of meaninglessness, the exact opposite of vanity, of just breath, of just dust in the wind, another 60s song. What's the opposite of all of that we can't get a handle on that seems meaningless? It's the ground under our feet. There was a theologian actually in the 1960s who talked about these verses in Ecclesiastes and talked about God not as being up in the sky, but God as being the ground under our feet, as the very ground of being. When everything seems meaningless, like it's just going to be one thing after another, there's nothing new under the sun, all of our work is for nothing, all of this Congress, yes, no, all the hot air, when it seems like it's for nothing, we can remember that God is not the hot air above us. God is the ground under our feet. And that was comforting to this theologian and comforting to Pete Seeger. And I would say to that Lutheran pastor back in the 1760s, it was comforting to know that God is going to be there as the ground under our feet, no matter where we might go, no matter what hot air might come out of any other places. And we know that God is the ground of being. This theologian said, God is the being that grounds us, and God is like the earth under our feet, as steady as that ground. He said that Jesus is the being. And so we know that in all the seasons of our life, in even the season of death, it says that, a time to be born, and there is a time to die. We know that Jesus represents to us that God is the ground of being, and even when there is no being left, God can create something new. God can bring those seasons about. Life into death, and then death into life. Amen.